Sabs, how up to date are you on your history regarding Palestine? Are you
pretty up to date, I think.
Okay.
Pretty up to date.
So there's two videos that I want to share first. One's going to be a more central, localized version of the history of Palestine. This is going to be kind of like a bit of a crash course, right? And so that's what's going to give you guys up to speed of what, from the Palestinian perspective, what has happened and where we are today, right? Then we're going to broaden out, go at 30,000 feet, and we're going to look at it from a more capitalistic view in how it has and how capitalism is involved in the creation of the state of Israel. Okay, and I want you guys to put your socialist and communist hats on, because that's where we're going to go. We're gonna do almost like a Marxist analysis of this. Okay, so this is going to be very interesting. So I implore you guys, if you guys have not, please make sure to stay tuned. All right, so let me see. Is this it? Or is this it? This is it. Okay. So, all right. And please make sure to like the stream, by the way. Okay, so.
In this video, I'm going to explain to you why I keep seeing Palestinians being called barbaric, savage terrorists. So we're in the late 1800s, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism going on in Europe. This anti-Semitism leads to the creation of a movement called Zionism. Zionism was basically the belief that Jewish people needed their own state. So they went to Argentina, they went to Uganda, but ultimately they decided on Palestine. But who was in Palestine? Palestinians, who were not just Muslims, by the way. They were Christians, Jews, Muslims, but they were all identified as Palestinians living in this land. Palestinians who were already under British rule saw this influx of Jewish immigration into Palestine and the whole concept of Zionism. We want to create a Jewish state and exclude the Palestinians as a threat to their own sovereignty. So in 1917, the British signed this document called the Balfour Declaration, which basically said, yes, the Jewish people are going to get their state, we're going to help them, and fuck the Palestinians, basically. And after one of the most horrific events in history, the Holocaust, there was obviously a great influx of Jewish immigration into Palestine once again. So from the early 1900s until 1948, there was a double colonization happening to the Palestinian people. There was, first of all, just the British presence there, and then there was the mass Jewish immigration that was funded by the British with no regards to Palestinian sovereignty. And in 1948, the Nakba happened. The Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, was the ethnic cleansing of almost 1 million Palestinians, including my grandfather. And since 1948, Palestinians have been two things: stateless and living under a military occupation in Palestine. Palestinians want equal rights in their historic homeland, but they have not been afforded this right since 1948. 75 years of land theft, 75 years of oppression, 75 years of no rights for Palestinians. And naturally, like history will show you, resistance movements started popping up, including Hamas, which was actually funded by Israel in the 1990s. Since 1948, Palestinians have not been afforded the right to context. Think about the representation of Arabs in movies. We're either in a pack and there's no faces and there's an American hero and he's just trying to kill all of us because we're dumb. Or it's the rich sheikh that has 17 wives. And Hollywood and American media has created this narrative that Palestinians just come out of their mother's wombs and we just want to kill Israelis. We're not afforded the right to context. We're not afforded the right to talk about these 75 years of oppression that we've been going through. We're not afforded this right because American media just wants to dehumanize Palestinians so that normal people, when they see, it's like, oh, they just are terrorists, they're barbaric, they want to kill Jews, and oh my God. When in reality, it's been 75 years of oppression and military occupation. 75 years. So as you navigate the news these days and you see that Palestinians are savage terrorists, we're barbaric, just keep in mind our fight for freedom and justice over the past 75 years. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why I keep.
So,
yeah.
Basically, this kind of gives an overview as to why the Palestinians are fighting. So, according to the Geneva Conventions, according to the UN, when you are a people and you are occupied by an outside force, you have the right to fight against and resist that outside occupying force by any means necessary. So, what's going on for the last 75 years has been different ways and methods of resisting this occupying force that Palestine and Palestinians have been engaging in. And so this is not anything new. People will bring up October 7th. October 7th is just a long list. It's just a point in a long line of resistance acts that the Palestinians have been engaging in for 75 years. Because if you have a land that you're living on and your family has been living on it for generations, and then somebody else who's not the owner of that land gives it away to someone else who's not you, and then those people come in and move you out of that land, that's what's been going on. So this is the story, right? Okay, now.
And I was just going to say, and remember, guys, it was the British who made that decision. They were the ones that decided and said, okay, well, you can go have this land over here. So that's important for you to know, so you understand why the UK government stands on the side of the state of Israel, because they kind of started all of this, if you look back on it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for pushing in that point, Sabs. Now we're going to look at it from 30,000 feet. Okay, so you guys got the localized. This is why. Now let's take a look at this. And I have really this is why I love TikTok. You can learn so much on TikTok. It just depends on what you look for in the algorithm, but the algorithm tailors it to you. So this is one of the things I love. So we just saw this guy. Let's continue.
Explain to you why I keep seeing Palestinians being called barbaric, savage terrorists.
All right, I want to add an international lens to what this creator is saying, because I think you can't really talk about Islamic terrorism as it's referred to in the West without mentioning the rise and fall of secular Arab nationalism in the mid-1900s. This is so relevant because what's commonly referred to as the end of secular Arab nationalism is in 1967 when.
So when he says secular Arab nationalism, he's basically meaning non-religious ran government. So it's basically just secular, meaning that, you know, you're not influenced by Christianity, Judaism, Islam, none of that. It's just secular. So just wanted to point that out. Let's go back.
When Israel launched the Six-Day War against its surrounding Arab nations. This is also when it captured Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. But I'll get back to that in a little bit because I have a lot of history to cover and I don't want it to take more than a few minutes. Because this goes back to World War I, when Britain and France actually enlisted the support of Arab fighting forces against the Central Powers, specifically the Ottomans, who had controlled most of the Middle East at that point. And the way they did that was they promised the Arabs independence after the war was over if they won. And honestly, it's wild that the Allied nations still take credit for winning World War I without even mentioning the Arab Revolt of 1916. And in a surprising turn of events, the British and French actually lied. And not only did they not give the Arabs self-determination as they agreed upon, not that the Ottoman Empire wasn't a thing anymore, they just took the region for themselves. Now, does this look familiar at all? Maybe from your history class in high school, you have the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Notice how this says May 1916. This is a month before the Arab Revolt and like a year and a half before the end of World War I. So what does that mean? That means that the British and French were lying to these people's faces, telling them that they'll get self-determination for fighting against the Ottomans, when really they had a plan to divide up the entirety of the Middle East between themselves.
What does this sound like, Sabs?
This is basically like just Western imperialism, but it kind of reminds me of what happened to, you know, indigenous people in the United States.
Yeah. This reminds me of when they divvied up different parts of Africa and said, okay, you can have this, you can have that, you can have that. And then it became basically just this settler colonial project where you have France and then Belgium and United States and Britain and Germany and all these different nations in Italy. They all carved up different parts of Africa. Okay, we're going to call this area Kenya. We're going to call this area South Africa. We're going to call this area Niger, and in Nigeria. We're going to call these areas these instead of going actually to the actual names of the areas according to the indigenous African names of the areas. And on top of it, you have a lot of African nations where their tribes were in their areas were split between borders of countries, even though, you know, you have those different tribes. And now they're in between two different countries. So now they're, you know, in between, a border was crossed between them. So it just goes to show where this is nothing new that the West has done. and they've done it to Africa as well. So
they've done this to indigenous people too. The same thing. Like, well, you guys can have that land over there. Just stay over there, and we'll just have this. And then before you know it, what happened? Like colonialism, it spreads, right? So it spread all across North America, not just in what became the United States, but also in what we know now as Canada. So that's another reason why when you talk about indigenous people, this is part of the reason why you don't see many indigenous people in this country is, number one, because you did have Western powers that came over here and killed indigenous people. That's why their population is so small. But then also that they basically restricted them to those reservations and said, you can have the reservations and we'll let you have casinos on those reservations, et cetera. And even with the reservations, the idea was that the US government was not supposed to intervene on that land, but they do. They do this when they decide to implement pipelines that go through indigenous land and things like that. So long story short, the US government didn't keep their promise to the indigenous people either.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that historical context, Sabs. Let's continue.
Also, look, Palestine under British, French, and Russian protection. Remember that. Here's another thing you might remember from your world history class, the Balfour Declaration, which establishes Palestine also as a national home for Jews. But Israel isn't first established until after World War II. So in the meantime, Arabs who are really upset, obviously, at the British and French occupying them, launch a bunch of independence movements. This includes countries like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. This takes us to World War II, specifically the aftermath of World War II, which is millions of Jews fleeing Nazi rule, many of whom are urged by the British and other allied countries to set up shop in Palestine. As a side note, notice how Western European countries conveniently redirect a lot of Jewish refugees to an area that is very far from them. All right, 1948, Israel declares independence, which leads to the first Arab-Israeli war. With the help of the British, Israel successfully protects its independence, which leads to the Nakba, which is the expulsion of almost 1 million Palestinians from their ancestral homes. Now, during this time, Arab nationalism is surging, especially after gaining independence from the British and the French, and as a response to the establishment of Israel. In 1952, Egypt has a revolution which leads to Jamal Abdel Nasser becoming president in 1956. This is generally considered to be the start of the Arab Cold War, which this is important, by the way, because this is a rivalry between Arab nations that consider themselves to be secularist, nationalist, and generally tend to be socialist.
What did he say? Secularist,
Typically,
nationalist. Sorry, go ahead.
Typically socialist.
Typically socialist. So he said the Arab Cold War. Yes, there was a Cold War going on here too. Let's continue.
And Arab nations that are conservative, traditionalist, Islamist, and generally tend to be monarchies. Now, Saudi Arabia doesn't like secularism because it's Islamist. It also doesn't like socialism because it's traditionalist. Now let's think for a second, right? This is the Arab Cold War, which is part of the Cold War. Which side in the Cold War tended to identify as being anti-socialist? The United States. The United States did not want Soviet communism spreading through the Middle East, so they signed a mutual defense assistance agreement with Saudi Arabia. This was the official start of US-Saudi relations, and notice in this case how the United States aligned itself with Islamists against secularists.
Now we're getting to it. Because here's the thing. If you notice, what's the right wing really known for in this country? They're known for being extremely religious. So,
not just necessarily religious, but more so Christian.
Yeah, Christian religious. But if you notice, the United States always teams up with the most zealous religious aspects of a government, even abroad. So whether it's extreme right-wing Judaism, extreme right-wing Christianity, or extreme right-wing Islam, the United States will team up with it because they're more favorable to capitalism.
So essentially, guys, it wasn't so much about the United States saying, okay, we need to make sure that, Jewish people are protected and are safe. It was more so we need to make sure that socialism does not spread in the Middle East.
Let's continue.
against secularists. Now, this finally takes us back to the Six-Day War, 1967, when Israel takes over not just Gaza, not just the West Bank, but Golan Heights and Sinai too. This deals, I can't even begin to explain how big of a deal this war was. This deals such a huge blow to the Arab world, but it's...
This note says, obviously, this destroyed Palestine, specifically the PLO, which was secularist and socialist. Remember that historically, Palestinian independence movements were secular, inclusive of Jews and Christians, unlike Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Especially Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which were secular nations. And this is the moment when the United States comes in and starts its long-standing alliance with Israel. This is from the BBC, by the way. After 1967, the Americans looked at Israel with new eyes. It fell in love with the young Sabras who had beaten 3 Arab armies. And in doing so, the US took the reins from Britain and France in being the Western nation that keeps the Middle East in line. All right, y'all, we're reaching the end. Honestly, this took way longer than expected, so thanks for bearing with me. At this point, secular Arab nationalism is more or less demolished, especially after Iran stages a theocratic revolution. But there is one strong, freestanding nation left that is secular, and that's Iraq. Does that ring a little bit of a bell, y'all? The war in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Let me show you a video real quick.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
I was like 5 years old when the United States captured Saddam Hussein after invading Iraq.
He says in the notes, remember how we literally lied about WMDs to justify invading Iraq, leading to the destruction of Iraq and hundreds of thousands of deaths, including Americans? Yep, I remember.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea what was going on then. And now I finally understand. Now, the point I'm making with this entire video, like 100 years of history, is that time and time again, the United States has sided with Islamists. And this primarily has been done through its alliance with Saudi Arabia. Through this, it's toppled with other Western nations, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. And in Palestine in particular, this meant the destruction of the PLO, which was a secularist, socialist, Arab nationalist party. And guess who they were replaced by? The Israeli-funded Hamas organization. I have a video about this, but Israel funded Hamas as well, which was an Islamist organization so that they could fight against the secularists, the same strategy that the United States did. And just like what happened...
It says more specifically, the U.S. funded the Mujahideen, which the Taliban splintered off from, and destabilized Afghanistan, creating a power vacuum for them to take power.
In Afghanistan, where the Islamists that the United States funded started fighting back against the U.S.
His note says, also note that Israel never explicitly aligned with Hamas, and Hamas was always pro-Palestinian independence. My point is that just that the United States and Israel will fund Islamists to fight against their enemies and then turn back and call them terrorists once the threat is taken care of. I worded this part wrong. Okay.
The same thing happened in Palestine, where Hamas started fighting back against Israel. Now that is why you see the term terrorist everywhere, because the United States will fund any and every Islamist movement they can find as long as they're fighting against their enemies. And then the moment those Islamist movements start fighting back against the US, they're terrorists. And if that sounds so familiar, it's because that is the same thing that the British did to what would become the secular Arab nationalists in funding them to fight their enemies, the Ottomans. Welcome to modern geopolitics, y'all. I hope you enjoy your stay.
Now, this is important for people to really understand and grasp, because the thing is this, and I'll use the example with ISIS. One of the problems with the U.S. taking out Saddam Hussein is that actually opened the door for ISIS. When Saddam Hussein was in power, and yes, he was a dictator. We're not saying he's a good person. He was a dictator. But when Saddam Hussein was in power, he was able to keep those extremist groups in check. It wasn't until Saddam Hussein was physically removed that those extremist groups like ISIS came to power. And I believe, and I've said this for a while, I really believe that the U.S. wanted that to happen because it gave the United States a reason to fight Iraq. It gave the U.S. a reason to continue war in the Middle East. And what can they say? They can say, we have to fight ISIS. We have to stop that group. But the U.S. government, oftentimes through their interventions, they create a door, they open a door for those types of groups to rise in the first place, which is exactly what the U.S. government wants to happen in order to continue to have these wars abroad in the Middle East and support the military industrial complex.
Exactly. And it's also more of a twofold. So it's also to fund the military industrial complex, but also to gain all of the resources within that given area. Typically, a lot of it has to do with oil, petroleum, liquefied natural gas, and in the case of Afghanistan, opium. So this is one of the reasons why. So always go back to the money. Always. Because that's ultimately money and resources. Because it's like, well, why would Israel want to be, why would you want to put a nation like Israel in that area? By the way, they were going to go to places like in Africa, I think it was Uganda, to put Israel there, but they decided on Palestine. So just goes to show. Yep. Now, just wanted to point this out as well. Gamer for Life said Gaddafi, who was over Libya, wanted off the U.S. petrodollar, and that's why the establishment hated him. This is a good point because Gaddafi was more secularist in the way he went about things, and he was further left, meaning closer to socialism. He probably wasn't an out-and-out socialist, but he was closer to it. And so because he was introducing that type of programs, social programs, and he was introducing wanting to get off the petrodollar, they viewed him as a huge threat. And so this is exactly why the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, I think it was the 1950s, as well as they tried to overthrow every single secular Arab leader because they were toying with socialism, and that they didn't like.
The other thing about Gaddafi, too, is that he wanted Africa to become dependent from Western influence. He didn't want Africa to continue to depend on countries like the U.S., France, England, etc. He wanted them to break away from that and stand on their own. And that's another reason why they wanted to take Gaddafi out.
Mm-hmm. Good point from Zoya. She says Saddam Hussein also was moving off petrodollar until the CIA supported him.
And I want to bring up the part about Christianity too, like the missionaries, because this is something that I think, some people may not make this connection, but for people like me and you, Jaybe, that grew up in the church, like one of the things that you are supposed to do, whether you're, Christian or Jaybe was like Jehovah's Witness, is that you're supposed to spread the gospel, right? So you're supposed to essentially, recruit people to be a part of, Christianity, in Jaybe's case, a Jehovah's Witness, that kind of thing. That is one of the things you're supposed to do. So if you remember someone like Billy Graham, who was really popular for this, he traveled all across the world spreading Christianity. Now, when I was growing up, I thought like, oh, the missionaries, like that's a good thing. They're going and traveling and talking about the Bible and things like that. And sometimes also helping those communities, like through programs like Habitat for Humanity and helping build houses and things like that as well. But the point that I'm trying to make is this. Also, when you think about the missionaries, that also is tied to what? What is Christianity essentially tied to when we talk about political parties? Usually it's tied to the Republican Party, right? So one of the things that I was thinking about, even when we talk about spreading Christianity all across the world and the work that the missionaries do, essentially that's also an effort to stop the spread of socialism. Because if you are getting people to adapt to Christianity, and like I said, Christianity typically is connected to the right, to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party does not support any form of socialism, then you are also, in a way, trying to stop the spread of socialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very true. And, Jehovah's Witnesses, they consider themselves Christian. And so as far as their stance on Israel and Palestine, I don't think they actually agree with what Israel's doing, from what I know, because there's Jehovah's Witnesses in Palestine as well as Jehovah's Witnesses in Israel, and they see each other as brothers and sisters. They typically don't go up against each other like that. At least they're not supposed to. I'll put it that way. But that's from what I know, and I've actually seen like conventions where the Palestinian Jehovah's Witnesses and the Israeli Jehovah's Witnesses will come together and they'll hug each other, and there'll be one group in solidarity. But that's kind of rare. And also I shared a petition earlier today about Christians that were condemning Israel for what they were doing and calling on Western Christians to also condemn Israel for what it's doing and to call for the ending of the occupation. So
that's good,
that was
and that's good. More people waking up, because the other thing is too is like growing up in the church, people have to understand that capitalism is promoted in the church. From the moment that they pass around the collection plate and tell you to donate tithes to the church, because that'll help the church. And in return, it will help you financially as well, because you're giving and then you're going to receive, it's going to help you as well. Capitalism was heavily promoted, particularly, and we talked about this before, Jaybe, about the Black church. I mean, we talked about like some of the Black pastors that have these mega churches that have fancy cars, Cleflo Dollar has a private jet. So capitalism was heavily promoted when I was growing up in the church, not socialism, which is interesting because if you actually read the Bible, the message that Jesus is trying to spread is socialism.
Basically, I mean, was it the Apostle Paul that talked about how there needs to be equalizing taking place, so those who have much don't have too much, and those with little don't have too little. And this is basically the basis of the first century Christian congregation. So basically it was a taking of yourself, if you had more than enough, to help people so that there's more equity within, so that you can have that. But the thing is that some people will throw that away and say, well, we're not supposed to do that on a governmental level. We're supposed to just do that out of the kindness of our hearts. And I'm like, yeah, you can do that out of the kindness of your hearts through taxes. Like, it's like, what? So
even when it comes to immigration, if you're reading the Bible says that you're supposed to welcome people from strange and foreign lands. You're not supposed to shut the door on them. So again, like I said before, political parties, they cherry pick certain things out of the Bible to help their political cause.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I don't want to get too far on this, but this is something, Sabs, this is your home girl. You're gonna like this one. But this is going to be my jumping off point to another point that I wanted to talk about. And I'm going to have to go through this kind of quick but this is actually interesting because Israel is not done growing. I'll share. Just like capitalism, Israel keeps going.
The fuck? Greater Israel is an expression. It has a biblical and political meaning to it that varied and evolved over time. It is known as the Zionist plan for the Middle East. The fuck? Watch this video and I'll be right back.
So hang on. Let me make sure I read it to you. So Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has provoked outrage. Now, just so that you guys are clear, Bezalel Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich was the one who said that he's a fascist homophobe. Just letting you guys know that, okay? Just to give you guys a synopsis of who he is. Now, that's who this guy is. Israel's finance minister. After he spoke in Paris behind this map of Greater Israel. It includes the occupied Palestinian territories, Jordan, and parts of Syria. So this is from Nidal Shahade. Says the Greater Israel Project genocide is now being promoted in the open. The Israeli Seller Minister of Finance spoke displaying a map of annexing Palestine, parts of Syria, Lebanon, and all of Jordan. This shouldn't surprise anyone. It's their ideology. Smotrich is far-right settler who backs the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements on occupied land in the West Bank. At the Paris speech, he said the Palestinian people were an invention. He says there's no such thing as Palestinian. There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. The Jordan Foreign Ministry condemned the podium map and summoned the Israeli ambassador. Israel's government said it was committed to its 1994 peace deal with Jordan.
So this includes Palestine, South Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. I mean, what the fuck is this? Many historians and international relations watchers state that this is the reason Israel is slowly and strategically grabbing more and more land from its neighbors, specifically Palestine. However, it is also important to keep in mind that the design of Greater Israel may not strictly be a Zionist project from the Middle East. So many experts and academics have been saying this recently, that this is part of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. hegemony to the Middle East.
Sabs, your thoughts?
But this is what, when we spoke to the Palestinian Network when they came onto RBN, this is exactly what they said the plan was. They tried to warn people back then. I think that was almost a year ago that they tried to warn people that the plan was never to stop with just Palestine. The plan was to extend even into Jordan. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this tonight in reference to the Queen of Jordan, because she made a statement recently in an interview. So this is what people have to understand. So the thing is this, it would be like when colonizers from Europe came to North America, it would be like them saying, we are only going to settle and occupy in the East Coast of this region, North America. We're only going to stay on the East. We're not going to move to the middle part of North America. We're not going to move to the West Coast part of North America. We're just going to stay right here. Obviously, that did not happen. That doesn't make sense if you think about it. When you think about colonialism, the goal is to acquire as much land as possible, regardless if there's people on that land or not. So why would the state of Israel just stop at Palestine? They would not. The plan is to contend and to make it bigger. So again, what's going to happen to those people that live in those areas in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria? Where are those people supposed to go? And then you also have to know that Israel isn't just bombing Gaza and the West Bank. Israel is also bombing Syria and Lebanon as well. So what I'm trying to say is this: the plan is to take over the land. That's the plan, whether there's people there or not.
Yep. So let's continue. I'm not going to do the whole video, but I just want to continue just a little bit.
The fuck? Such a policy being pursued by the U.S. in this region goes along with the Yinon plan. This plan is an Israeli set strategy to ensure regional superiority. It is a continuation of an earlier ploy that Britain used in the Middle East. So the red is what they want Israel's borders to be.
So I'm going to share right now with you guys this particular map, just so that you guys are aware of the plan of what they're trying to do. So this is an article entitled "What is Greater Israel? Why the idea is not acceptable to the Palestinians and Islamists." So if we're going to take a look, here is the picture, right? So if you guys can see, this is Egypt down here in the lower left-hand corner. Below to the south is Saudi Arabia. Up to the northeast is Iraq. I'm sorry, to the east is Iraq. To the northeast is Syria. And then within it, you have Jordan, Lebanon, and of course, this little gray piece right there, that's actually Palestine. That's all Palestine.
Well, the Saudi Arabia piece is really interesting, considering the fact that Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States, even though Saudi Arabia has been invited to join BRICS. So this brings up a whole other question. What happens when they try to go into Saudi Arabia? What is the U.S. government going to do then? since the
That's a
U.S.
good
still
question.
depends on oil from Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good question. So that's what the plan for Greater Israel is. And so they want to expand way past this so that they end up taking up more of this land. So ultimately, that's what this is. And so I wanted to go to, let me see. Right here. It says the United States of America has been an ardent supporter of Israel and was among the first countries to accept its existence. The U.S. finds trade in oil in exchange of arms and technology with Israel. It is also useful in maintaining its hegemony in the Middle East. President Donald Trump has talked about his support of Israel's illegal settlements in 2017. This also included the opposition to UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which pertains to the illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank area. Trump administration also recognized Israeli sovereignty over Golan Heights, along with the complete West Bank being annexed to Israel. Under the Biden administration, Washington, D.C. remains supportive of Israel's plans to annex the Jordan River Valley, along with illegal settlements in the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it is just, and then this also gives the Muslim reaction as to why they are against it, why Muslims are not are against it. But yeah, it says United Nations on Greater Israel, as stated in the UN report in 2017, Israel is currently proceeding with the plan to annex large chunks of Palestinian territory while keeping the Palestinian inhabitants conditions of severe deprivation and isolation. As per the research, Israel is proceeding with the plan to annex large chunks of Palestinian territory while keeping the Palestinian inhabitants in conditions of severe deprivation and isolation.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah, it talks about the balkanization of surrounding Arab states, turning them into smaller, weaker states. So that's basically what's going on. This is really the plan for Israel. And really, it's just as capitalism, grows infinitely, with finite resources, it's the same thing with Israel, is that they plan to grow and to consume.
And this is also why you need a separation of church and state. Because
Absolutely.
imagine if something like that happened in the United States, where like if you weren't Christian, you were slowly pushed out of the United States. And then you can get to the racial part of that as well. I mean, it's just, I want people to don't pretend like you live there, because if you haven't been there, you don't have that experience. Pretend like it was happening here. That's how I want people to think about. Pretend like it was happening here. Pretend like you all of a sudden slowly get pushed out, not just because of your religion, but also because of your ethnicity, yada, yada, et cetera. Imagine that. Now, we already went through that in this country before. And even when they say, well, we gave them this territory so they can stay there, they essentially pushed Palestinian people into ghettos, limit their resources. So the state of Israel controls all the resources. Imagine if that happened to you. And all of a sudden, like, you had no power, like everything was just controlled, by another group, and they could turn it off whenever they want to and only give you as much as they want to give you. So that's how I kind of want you to think about that. And I also want to remind you too, even if you think back to Black Wall Street in this country, that's another example where basically the US government, the powers that be in Jim Crow South were like, okay, now that the slaves are free, they have their own communities, they do their own thing. So you had Black neighborhoods, Black towns that had their own businesses. So the dollar constantly turned in the Black community. Well, what happened? Once those businesses started to become competitor to white businesses outside of the Black community, white people came and burned those businesses down. So this idea of, we gave you this space, we gave you this land, and you can have that and you'll be fine and we'll leave you alone. That's never the case. That's never the case. The goal of the group that is in power is to always maintain in power. And if they feel that you are a threat to that power, they are going to get rid of you.
So ultimately, Israel is just a tool of the United States in order to keep tabs on the Middle East so that they can grow their hegemony. So thus resulting in greater profits for corporations in this country.